So welcome everyone this evening. My name is Alicia Herzog. I am the Iowa Master Gardener Program Manager. I'm also the host of the Home Gardening Webinar Series, and I want to welcome you. Thank you for joining us this evening for the first session of our 2026 Home Gardening Webinar Program, Gardening for Wildlife. Now, I am pleased to introduce our speaker. Fanny Riand is a current master's student in wildlife ecology at Iowa State University. For her research, she studies how birds and pollinators respond to landscaping decisions in residential yards, particularly to the inclusion of native plants. Additionally, she uses social science methods to better understand the motivations and barriers for growing native plants in urban spaces. Before coming to Iowa State, she gained experience studying birds and pollinators through several positions, including an internship at Archbold Biological Station, working as a field technician for Neighborhood Nest Watch, and working for the U.S. Forest Service at Salmon Chalet National Forest in Idaho. She graduated with a dual BS degree in biology and natural resource conservation from UMass Amherst in 2022. So we're very happy to have her here with us today to share her research and wonderful information. I'm going to stop sharing. I will see you all at the end of the presentation for Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Alicia, so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to take a second to share my slides here. Okay. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Yeah, so thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited to see so many of you and to get to discuss this topic, gardening for wildlife. It's one that I find super fascinating, and it's very prominent in my own research that I'm conducting at Iowa State University with Dr. Adam Janke, who is also on this webinar here today. So without further ado, let's get into it. This might be a little bit, oh, I'm going to hide this box. Sorry, it might be a little bit redundant because Alicia so kindly introduced me, but I'm a current master's student at Iowa State University, graduating this spring, and my major is in wildlife ecology. I'm also pursuing a graduate certificate in public management and policy while at Iowa State University, and my research focus during my master's has been using both biological techniques and social science to better understand how we can improve wildlife habitat in cities. And I'm originally from France, but I've grown up most of my life in Massachusetts. So to give you a quick overview about what today's presentation will look like, I'm going to start with a brief overview of both the background motivating my research and our findings. Then we'll get into key components of a wildlife-friendly yard, which I'm sure will be of a lot of interest to many of you, and you can hopefully take that information with you and implement it into your own yard. And lastly, part 3 is coexisting with wildlife. We'll touch on this briefly because that's also an important component of having wildlife in our backyards. Also, I'm just going to check the chat really quick that everything's going well okay, sounds good. Okay, so first into some background for what inspired our research and what we have found. So as many of you are probably aware, cities around the world are expanding, and this is having many different impacts on wildlife, including several pretty negative ones. For example, we're introducing more pesticides into landscapes, which can harm wildlife. We also have more and more lawn monocultures, which provide pretty little habitat for wildlife like pollinators. We're also seeing the introduction of more exotic plants into landscapes, which again, because they haven't co-evolved with the native wildlife, also have some limited benefits there. And we're also seeing an increase in the spread of invasive plants, which take advantage of the disturbances caused by cities. So all of this paints a pretty bleak picture of cities in terms of what they can do for wildlife, and it actually makes urbanization one of the top global threats to biodiversity. But that's not what I want to focus on today. Today, I want to actually focus on what benefits cities may be able to offer for wildlife. And I think Iowa is actually a great place to study this because, as I'm sure you're all aware, it is a landscape that's dominated by agriculture. As you can see on this map here, in the orange, everything there is cultivated crops, mostly of corn and soybean. And these large monocultures typically don't provide very good habitat for wildlife. At the same time in Iowa right now, we're seeing some rapid growth around the Des Moines metro area. So in these counties right here in pink and dark pink, we're seeing the highest population growth, with the Dallas County actually having a population growth rate of over 50%, which is one of the highest in the nation. So what this means is that in the farmland surrounding these counties, a lot of it right now is being converted for urban development, which prompts us to ask, could this urban expansion into what was previously farmland have a silver lining for wildlife? In other words, maybe we have an opportunity here to provide better habitat for wildlife in our cities than these crop monocultures can, but that it's only if we employ practices that are intentional and actually support wildlife. So this leads me to my research question today. What characteristics drive biodiversity in Iowa yards? Because if we can understand that, then we can make sure we're offering yards that are actually helping biodiversity. And our prediction is that native vegetation in a yard will best predict bird abundance, bird diversity, and pollinator abundance. And our reasoning behind this prediction was that native vegetation has co-evolved with the native fauna, and thus it should probably be providing better benefits than non-native plants. So to answer this question, we studied yards all around the Des Moines metro area. We used a paired study design. First, we recruited some yards by working with both Plant Grow Fly and the National Wildlife Federation. Both of them offer programs for people to register or certify yards with native plants. And so this kind of ensured that we were including some yards with native plants in our study. We also included only yards that were in recently developed land. If you look at this map, you can see that all the yards are along the urban farmland interface. So we really want to focus on this new urban development because that's what we're interested in, and also to just reduce confounding variables if we included other yards. And I think I forgot to mention, so every time we recruited a yard with native plants, we actually paired that yard with a random neighbor within 1 kilometer just to get a mix of different yards. So in total, we had 32 yards in our study. We had 16 registered yards with native plants and 16 that were just randomly paired to those yards. So in each of these yards, we conducted several different kinds of biological surveys to better understand what wildlife were using them and what the characteristics of those yards were. First, we conducted some bird surveys, so that consisted of sitting in a yard and both counting the numbers of birds and noting the species. We conducted pollinator surveys, which entailed walking through yards and counting all the pollinator individuals and noting what types of pollinators they were and what plants they were interacting with. At the end of each pollinator survey, I conducted a floral survey just to get a sense of what flowers were present in the yard at the time, what was in bloom, and what the species of those flowers were. And finally, at the end of the season, we conducted tree and shrub surveys to get a sense of what trees and shrubs were in these yards, how big were they, and what species they were. So just a quick summary of our bird survey results. We had 29 total bird species across all 32 yards. The average number of species per yard was 12, and I counted an average of 19 individual birds per yard per survey. And we also noted 49 observations of breeding activity. So that could mean anything from us finding a nest or seeing adults feeding their young. And I think this is really cool because it just highlights that birds are actively using people's yards to raise their young. So in case you're curious, here are the most abundant bird species that we found in people's yards. Unsurprisingly, we have the American robin as the most abundant bird, but we also have some other cool native species like the American goldfinch and the barn swallow. I'm sure you've seen many of these species in your own yards. And then here are just some quick summary results from our pollinator and floral surveys. We found an average of 40 pollinators per yard. The minimum we found was 8, and the maximum was 103 in one survey. We also found an average of 12 native bee individuals per yard. The max we found in one yard was 44, and the minimum was 0, so a lot of variety there. And we also saw different amounts of native flower species, with the average being 8 per yard, the maximum 27, and the lowest we found was 0. So next, we had taken all these measurements in people's yard, but we wanted to bring all that together to create one single index to measure biodiversity in yards. So we took these 6 different variables. We had native bird abundance, native bird species diversity, the numbers of bumblebees, butterflies, native bees, and hoverflies, which are all important pollinators, and we wanted to combine these all together to make a single index of biodiversity. And so we did exactly that. And this lets us let us create a biodiversity index scale. So every yard ranged from a score from 0 to 6, with 0 meaning that yard had the lowest possible biodiversity, and to 6 meaning it had the highest. So now that we had a single metric to measure biodiversity in yards, we wanted to know what best predicted that biodiversity. And to do this, we had to use some statistics. So we constructed 2 different statistical models. And sorry about the stats on this slide, but I promise they'll be short. On the left side here of the equation, you can see what we were trying to predict, which was the biodiversity index. And then on the right side of the equation, we'll see what the predictor variables were. So for this first model, our total vegetation model, we included these variables. We included total basal area, which is just a way to measure the amount of trees in a yard. We included total shrub volume, which is, again, total amount of shrubs, and then total open flowers. And so that was all the vegetation in a yard. And then for the native vegetation model, we did the same thing, but we only included the native subset of each of these. So it was only native trees, native shrubs, and native open flowers. And by constructing these 2 models, we could try to see which was the better model, and thus if nativeness has an influence on the biodiversity index. And so we ran these models and we found 2 interesting results. First, we did find that the native vegetation model was the better model and thus could better predict biodiversity in yards. Our other interesting result was that each of these predictor variables, both the amount of native trees, native shrubs, and native flowers, were all positively associated with the biodiversity index, meaning that if these increased, then the biodiversity index tended to increase. So what does this mean? Well, it means that native vegetation better predicted biodiversity in yard than just total vegetation, which is providing support that native plants really do have benefits for wildlife, more so than just including any plants in your yard. And I want to highlight that our models were showing that it wasn't just the flowers, but also native trees and shrubs as well. So what our research is doing is helping corroborate what other research has also found, indicating that native plants are really important to include in our yards for wildlife. So now I'm going to transition here away from my research with Dr. Adam Janke and now talk about key components of a wildlife-friendly yard. And I'll be referring to several different resources during this part, hopefully things you can consult later because there's so much to talk about and use yourself in implementing these. So there will be a lot of QR codes, but don't worry if you don't have time to snap a picture. Alicia has kindly put together a Word document in the Zoom chat that you can access and have all those links available to you later. So don't worry about having to snap photos very quickly. So first, unsurprisingly, a key component of having a wildlife-friendly yard is growing native plants. So choose plants that are native to your region. For us, it would be the Midwest. Make sure to include both native trees, shrubs, grasses, and flowering plants. And this can have multiple benefits. Like we just talked about, of course, native plants provide great food and shelter for native wildlife, but it's also not just that. They also require less water and maintenance since they're adapted to the local climate conditions and the soil conditions. They just need less of those and are hardier compared to non-native plants. And they also have deep roots, which help reduce soil erosion and aid in stormwater management. And finally, growing native plants is a great way to learn more about the nature in your area and also for you to enjoy because they're really beautiful and draw in a lot of beautiful pollinators and other wildlife. So some examples of plants that are native to Iowa, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with these. We have trees like red oaks, red maples, and shagbark hickory. We have shrubs like arrowwoods, serviceberry, and chokeberry. We have flowering plants like bee balm, which is in this photo here with a bumblebee, Joe Pyeweed, and black-eyed Susans. And we also have grasses like little blue stem, big blue stem, and Indian grass. And I just wanted to shout out the grasses because they're often forgotten, but they're also really valuable in terms of providing cover for birds and insects. And birds can feed on the seeds and also feed on the insects that live in these grasses. So don't underestimate the grasses. So you might now be thinking, well, how do I know which plants are native? So I've tried to compile here a list of four different either databases or lists that I think are really helpful to help identify plants that are native to Iowa. This first one here is a list of native trees and shrubs from the Iowa DNR, which has some really helpful information about different native trees and shrubs, about their shade tolerance, their natural habitat conditions, and things like that. Iowa DOT also has this great Iowa native plants database in which you can easily search plants and identify whether they are native to Iowa. And it also comes up with information about each plant's growing requirements. So it has a lot of information there and is a great resource. National Wildlife Federation also has this great native plant finder. All you have to do is type in your zip code and it will pop out a lot of results about native plants in your area and will rank them by the number of butterflies and moths that they support. So it's really great, especially if you're looking to make a yard that brings in a lot of butterflies. And finally, this last resource, Iowa Commercially Available Native Plants from the Lady Bird Johnson Wildlife Flower Center, is a list of native plants that are native to Iowa that are also suitable, especially to planned landscapes like yards. So that's a really handy resource, and you can easily filter on this website for different plant requirements, like light requirements, soil requirements, and such. So that's a really helpful resource, I think. So now you may know, after using these resources, which plants are native, but the next big question is, where can you source native plants? And this can be sometimes a little tough, so I've included 4 different resources here that I think can help point you in the right direction. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has this great national suppliers directory, and if you filter through just Iowa, it will show you all these businesses and nurseries and other sellers in Iowa that offer native plants or services related to planting native plants. Iowa State also has this great list of Midwest native plant nurseries that you can access here. And the Tallgrass Prairie Center also has its own Iowa Prairie Seed and Service Providers list. So I think all of these complement each other really well and can help you find some native plant suppliers. And then I've also included this website here for Prairie Moon Nursery, which is an online native plant nursery vendor. And I think it's just a great example of a nursery that offers native plants, and it's a pretty popular one in the Midwest. I've heard good things, so just wanted to include that one in there. So a few tips for having successful native plantings. Make sure you're picking plants that suit your garden soil and light conditions. So there's a lot of native plants out there that are suited to different conditions in terms of sun, shade, and soil moisture. So just making sure you're picking the right plants for the right place. Also, you should choose seeds or plugs of native plants depending on your own budget and timeline. So seeds can be more economical, especially if you're planning to plant a large garden, but it will require more time for them to establish. You'll have to be patient. It might take several years. Plugs do cost more, but they generally provide a quick return on investment. So if you want to see pollinators in your yard as soon as the same growing season, that might be the way to go. And if you're using seeds, do plan to disperse them in the fall or late winter ahead of the summer growing season. And if you're doing that in the fall, just make sure that you're dispersing them and covering them with soil. And then if you're doing this in the late winter, you can just scatter them over the snow. So the next key component of a wildlife-friendly yard, I think, is diversifying your yard as much as possible, because yards with more diversity support a greater diversity of wildlife. And when I say diversity, there are multiple important aspects that I'm referring to. First, I mean plant species diversity, because the more different kinds of plant species you plant, which means different color flowers, different forms, the more different kinds of wildlife can use those plants and will be attracted to your yard. Also, make sure you're planting plants with diverse blooming times. This is a really big one. So make sure you have plants that are blooming in the spring, the summer, and the fall because pollinators are active during all of those seasons and are looking for those nectar resources. So you can really help them, especially pollinators that emerge early in the spring, like bumblebee queens. If you have some early blooming plants, that will really help them out. And finally, make sure you have some good structural diversity in your yard. So what I mean by that is have different layers of vegetation like trees, shrubs, herbaceous plants, and ground covers because these provide really important cover for wildlife and kind of helps mimic a more natural landscape for them. So make sure you include that diversity. Next, a really important way to have a wildlife-friendly yard is to include food resources. So for birds, they are really dependent on plants that are going to bear fruits, nuts, and seeds. So make sure you are, picking some plants that do have those things. And keep in mind that many plants can be both a food source and a place also for those birds to nest, hide, and roost in. So they kind of have that double benefit there. And also keep in mind that just by growing native plants that are beneficial for insects, you're actually also helping feed insect-eating birds and also birds that feed insects to their young. So even just having plants that support insects is going to indirectly also support birds. Next, make sure you're growing native plants that are rich in nectar for pollinators. And I also want to just note, don't forget to include in this trees and shrubs because sometimes those are forgotten. We often just think of flowers, but these can also be really important sources of nectar. For example, elderberry can be a really great source of nectar in the spring, and American lindens, which bloom in the early to midsummer, have these really huge blooms and can be a great nectar resource as well. Also, make sure you're including some host plants for butterfly species. So host plants are necessary for butterflies to lay their eggs, and they serve as food for their growing caterpillars. So butterflies essentially can't complete their life cycle without them. So if you deliberately include various host plants of different butterfly species, you'll be sure to attract more butterflies to your yard. The classic example that I'm sure many of you know is the monarch butterfly relying on native milkweed species. So here, I just wanted to provide a few resources that go along with this idea of providing food for wildlife. Here is this great table that I sourced from this publication from Iowa State University Extension Outreach. So feel free to check out the original publication. I think it's very worthwhile. But this table lists shrubs that are native to Iowa and different benefits that they have for wildlife. As you can see, some are really good at providing food, others at providing nesting places, and others at providing winter cover. So if you pick, a few of these shrubs and make sure you're hitting these different benefits for birds, you'll really make a positive impact for birds in your yard. Next, I wanted to highlight some nectar plants that are native to Iowa to really benefit pollinators. And as you can see here, we have quite a list of different flowering plants that pollinators will love. But we also have some shrubs and trees that are also really valuable nectar sources. And you'll even notice that a lot of these shrubs in this list overlap with the ones that benefit birds. So, shrubs help not just birds, but also pollinators and vice versa. And I just want to note too that any plants that are asterisks, it just means that some of those species of that plant are native and some aren't. So just do your due diligence to do some extra research and try to find varieties that are native to Iowa. And I also want to acknowledge that I found this great information from another publication from Iowa State University Extension called Gardening for Butterflies and Pollinators. And I would also recommend you check that out if you want to learn more. And finally, because we were talking about host plants for butterflies, I found this really great table, also from the same publication from Iowa State University Extension, with host plants for different butterflies that you can find in Iowa. So if you're trying to attract some specific butterflies, you can look to see their host plants here, or if you just want more of them, make sure you include some plants from this list, and you will probably get some more butterflies in your yard. Since we're talking about food and feeding, I also want to talk a little bit about bird feeders. They can be a great source of supplemental food for birds, especially in the winter when birds are hungry and it's cold and it's hard to find food. Having some fatty foods and feeders can really help them. But I do want to just have a little reminder here that the best way to feed birds is still to grow plants that consistently provide high quality food year after year. So plants that will produce seeds, nuts, and fruits. The feeders are really just more of a supplemental food source. So when you're feeding birds, I also want to say that you should keep season in mind. In the winter and fall, you can focus on feeding birds seeds and suet. And in the spring and summer, you can focus more on providing sugar water for hummingbirds and fruits for birds like orioles. And just a little note here, if you want to make your own hummingbird sugar water, it's very easy. You can mix 4 parts water to 1 part table sugar and just boil that mix to kill off any bacteria. And you can give that to hummingbirds and feeders. And you don't need to add any dye. Dye can actually be harmful for hummingbirds, so just leave it as is. Also, having a diversity of food types and feeder types is going to attract a greater diversity of birds. So when you're picking feeders, pick, some platform feeders, some tube feeders, pick some different heights also for the feeders, and that will help attract different species of birds. And also, if you have different food types, that'll attract different birds. Try to avoid some common bird food fillers like milo, sorghum, wheat, or corn. These don't have a lot of nutritional value for birds, so just try to avoid them. And a way you can do that is just avoid commercial seed mixes and instead just buy individual seed packs and set up seeders with a single type of seed. And that actually has a second benefit too, because then you have, feeders that are for a specific food source and are going to attract a specific kind of bird. So then you have different feeders doing different things. Next, if you want your garden to be wildlife friendly, you should try to provide sources of water because all wildlife species need water for drinking or bathing. Birds seek consistent water sources, especially ones with running water. So you can offer them bird baths, and if you want this water to be circulating, you can buy one that's commercially set up with a pump. You can also, if you're feeling creative, add a pond to your backyard. And this can be especially great in the wintertime if you have a heater in this pond because it'll stop the water from freezing over and it'll draw in a lot of birds that aren't able to get water anywhere else because of everything being frozen. So that's a great way to support birds in the winter. For pollinators, you can do a slightly different setup. You should use a shallow bowl with rocks for them to drink. The rocks allow them to perch and are really important to prevent them from, falling in there and drowning. And you just want to make sure to be changing the water regularly, 2 to 3 times a week, just to prevent mosquitoes from breeding. Another really important part of a wildlife-friendly yard is having shelter areas. So a great way to do that is to construct brush piles, dead wood log piles, or even a rock wall. And all of these offer really important cover, both for birds that are looking to hide or for insects such as nesting and overwintering bees. So resist the temptation to clean up your brush pile at the end of the season and leave it over the winter time because a lot of wildlife will use it and will be very grateful, I'm sure. Speaking of resisting the temptation to clean up, try to leave the leaves and dead stems over the winter in your garden. So a lot of different insects, such as bees and bumblebee queens, will overwinter in the leaf litter. So if you clean that up, you're taking away their habitat that they use to survive the winter. And a lot of bees also will stay in dead plant stems. So leave the stems, wait to clean up until things warm up in the spring. Also, leaving old flower heads of blooming plants can provide a great source of seeds for birds in the winter. So again, resist deadheading those flowers and just leave the seeds for the birds. Also, just a little bonus here, if you leave the leaf litter behind in your garden, it will act as a natural mulch for your garden bed because it'll suppress weeds, help retain some soil moisture, and enrich the soil as it composts. So it's kind of a win-win here for both wildlife and your garden. Also, try to grow some native shrubs like we were talking about earlier, and thickets for birds to hide and nest in. Birds really love that kind of dense shrubbery to hide their nests in and protect them from predators, so that's a great way to draw in birds. And I just want to note, do not prune during the nesting season these shrubs and trees because you don't want to disrupt nesting birds. And also, it's just a good practice to wait until the winter to prune when trees are and shrubs are dormant. Another last way you can create shelter is by planting evergreens because these provide great winter cover for birds. You know, birds also need protection from winter storms and winter winds, so having evergreens there can really help them in the winter time. Um, Lastly, or sorry, second to last, you can have a wildlife-friendly yard by avoiding harmful chemicals. So avoid them as much as you can, and if you do use them, make sure to do so safely and sparingly. I understand that sometimes, you know, when you have an invasive plant, it's really hard to get rid of. Sometimes herbicides becomes the only way, but just be mindful when doing that. And also try not to spray plants that are in bloom. If you are going to use any pesticides, do try to avoid any systemic insecticides like neonicotinoids as much as possible. These can be really harmful and potent chemicals. Even if you don't treat one plant, if that plant has roots in the same area as another plant that's treated, it's going to soak up those chemicals, and any pollinators that come pollinate that plant will be killed also. So just try to avoid those when you can. And finally, when you're purchasing plants, check that they were not treated with pesticides. And you can do this by asking the staff at your local nursery or your garden center. You can also go the extra step of seeking out USDA certified organic plants. And you can check with any online vendors or nurseries that you order from. They often have this information on their website, or you can call them or email them to find out. Finally, you can go the extra mile and register your wildlife-friendly yard. And this is a great way to share your hard work and also display a nice sign like the one in this picture for your garden. But it's also more than just a sign because putting a sign in front of your garden acts as a cue to care. And if you're not familiar with that term, cues to care are visual signals in a landscape that indicate to observers that a space is intentionally managed and not neglected. Some examples of this, aside from having a sign, are having neat edges in your yard, defined paths, and flower bed borders. And research has shown that having such cues increases the social acceptability of having a more natural looking yard. So if you have a wildlife friendly yard, a lot of people sometimes, you know, they might walk by it and they expect the traditional manicured lawn. Having a sign there can help explain that this is intentional and can actually get them curious about it and maybe want to try it out for themselves. Which ties into this, a sign also helps spread the word. So, you know, your yard can help make a difference, but we can make an even bigger difference if we have many wildlife-friendly yards. So, having a sign can kind of help advertise that and get more people interested in helping. So, you might be wondering now, where can I register my yard? And there's a lot of great organizations and certifications out there for a wildlife-friendly yard, and I'm going to talk about two today. One is the National Wildlife Federation has a great certified wildlife habitat certification, which is nationally recognized, and it has a strong emphasis on including native plants. And if you go to the QR code here, on their website, you can find a checklist of the elements that you need to certify your yard. And the other sorry. The other place I would recommend you could register your yard is with Plant Grow Fly, which is a local conservation initiative of the Blank Park Zoo in Des Moines. And anyone at any address can register their garden with them. You don't even need to have your garden being in Iowa. And the only requirement here to register your garden is to include at least one butterfly host plant and one nectar plant from lists that they provide. So the requirements is a lot lower for the Plant Grow Fly, registering your garden with them, and it's a bit higher for the Certified Wildlife Habitat Program, but these are both great programs and you could register your yard with one or both. So just a summary of the seven key components of a wildlife-friendly yard that we talked about. We talked about growing native plants, making sure your yard is diverse, including various food sources for both birds and pollinators, making sure you're offering water and you're creating areas of shelter, also avoiding harmful chemicals, and finally, just going that extra step and registering your yard. And here I've just put up here again these different resources, two of which we saw referenced in earlier slides, the Attracting Birds to Your Yard and Gardening for Butterflies and Pollinators, I think are two really handy resources. And I've also added here this new Iowa State University Extension publication called Four Things for Wildlife in Every Yard, which I think is also great and I recommend you check out. So for this last section of the talk, we'll be discussing coexisting with wildlife. So far, we've talked a lot about how we can attract wildlife to our yards, but as many of us have experienced, sometimes wildlife in the garden can create problems. This can include deer and rabbits eating plants, moles burrowing in our lawns, or nuisance birds like European starlings or house sparrows just creating a ruckus. And oftentimes, the only long-term sustainable solution when you have problem wildlife is to exclude them. So you can do this either by directly inhibiting their access, for example, by creating a fenced-off area or fences around your plants, or by changing the environment so it is no longer attractive or hospitable to these wildlife. So just like you can modify your yard to make better habitat for wildlife, you can change your yard to make it less attractive for certain wildlife. It's all about manipulating the habitat. And if excluding wildlife fails, the next step you might want to try is repellents. These can include scare devices like moving objects or loud noises, or chemicals that cause a non-lethal, undesirable taste. I will say though that these can have a mixed effectiveness, so you might have to try and test and see if that works, and some are more effective than others. A last resort would be a lethal control through trapping or pesticides. But importantly, you should know that many wildlife species, including almost all birds, game animals, and threatened or endangered species, have legal protections in Iowa. So definitely don't go that route without first consulting with your local conservation officer or work with a certified wildlife control operator. And here I've provided some resources that I think are really useful, both from Iowa State University Extension Outreach on mitigating conflicts with wildlife. So if you have problems with wildlife in your yard, I think this first article, Problem Wildlife, Common Questions and Issues, is a really great go-to resource. They cover a lot of different kinds of wildlife issues and possible solutions. So that might be your first stop. Another resource I've added here is contacts if you have a wildlife conflict. So you can find people in your county, like your local conservation officer that you can talk to if, if the problem has gone too big and you're trying to figure out what to do next. So another important part of coexisting with wildlife is also taking into account wildlife safety. So I want to just touch on that here. We talked about earlier how providing food for birds and feeders can be great, especially in the winter. But we should also be taking some precautions to avoid these feeders having any negative effects. For example, feeders should be placed far away from windows to avoid window collisions. You should also make sure to clean your feeder at least once every 2 weeks. You can do this by hand washing your feeder with either a 10% non-chlorine bleach solution or with a simple mixture of soap and hot water. And this is really good to keep, the feeder sanitary and reduce disease transmission between birds. You should also regularly inspect your feeders and replace any moldy food, especially after there's been a lot of rain, because when food turns moldy, it will accumulate toxins, which can be harmful to birds that ingest them. So make sure you're cleaning out any moldy food from your feeders. And finally, do keep your cats indoors if you have feeders up, because otherwise the birds are easy prey for your cats. And also try to place your feeders close to some shrubby cover so that birds can easily go hide when a predator shows up. But it's also you have to have a careful balance here actually, because you don't want your feeders too close to the cover because sometimes that's actually the perfect way for predators to hide. So a good rule of thumb is actually to place the feeder about 5 feet away from some sort of cover that the birds can take refuge in. Also, I guess along with that, make sure to be cleaning your bird baths once a week to avoid transmission of diseases between birds. Again, here you can use a 10% non-chlorine bleach solution to do this. And also never feed a white-tailed deer to reduce the spread of chronic wasting disease. This is a disease that has been emerging in Iowa that impacts deer. And to do your part in slowing the spread, just make sure you're not feeding deer and also make sure you're removing any bird feeders if you're seeing that deer are beginning to congregate around them. Okay, well, that's all I have for you today. I just want to take a minute to acknowledge people who made this possible. First, I want to acknowledge my advisor, Dr. Adam Janke, who has helped me tremendously with my research, and he is also the Extension Wildlife Specialist at Iowa State, so if you have questions, he's a great resource to go to. I also want to thank Dr. Kane Kincaid and Andy Kellner, who are my collaborators at the Iowa DNR and have also really helped with my research. I want to thank Christine Eccles and Ryan Smith, who have both been really helpful in helping connect me with homeowners who had native plants in their yards, which was really helpful for my research. And I also want to thank Evie Von Beckham, Jaden Jack, and Bellamy Beltramia, who helped me with fieldwork and data entry, which was a huge help. And finally, I want to thank all the homeowners from my study who graciously participated because without them, we could not have done all this research. So I'm very grateful. And I will be happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation slash conversation. People are very excited and happy about all the resources and information you shared. And we have some really great questions that we're going to get into. I have kind of categorized them. So first, we have some like research nerds or geeks out there that were like really interested in your research. And so we're going to go into some of the specifics of that. So the first couple questions were about what time of the year your surveys were, and were they once or were they over the season for herbaceous count? How did you do that?
Those are excellent questions. The first one was, sorry, could you repeat the first one? I
Yeah,
just forgot
it's
my model.
what time of year were the surveys done?
Yes, the surveys were in summer 2024. We had slightly different timelines for the bird and the pollinator surveys. Bird surveys were in June and July, and the pollinator surveys were July through August. And we visited each yard twice for the bird surveys and again twice for the pollinator surveys. And so then the statistics I was showing were actually averages of those two surveys for each yard. And we did the vegetation surveys, or sorry, the floral surveys after each pollinator survey, and then only one big tree and shrub survey at the end of the summer.
And when you were looking at the flowers and the pollinators, you said that you included only open flowers rather than forb species. And why did you do that?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Well, we were interested in what floral nectar resources were available because our hypothesis was that that would be the driver of pollinators in yards. So that's why we focused on flowers that were open and an available nectar resource.
And someone said, I understand that native plants create higher biodiversity source. How significant is that difference, though? Was it close or was it highly divergent?
Um, kind of a tough question. I mean, it was significantly different in statistical terms. The modeling we did generalized linear mixed models, and based on those results, there was a significant difference. Though I can't say I can quantify that specifically.
I might jump in on that one, Fanny, just because I've had more time to think about the answer. As you were speaking, I saw that really great question, and I actually tried to pull up your statistical analysis to see if I could even put some numbers to it, but I struck out. But that's a great question, and I just wanted to comment. Um, One of the things that we didn't in Fanny's presentation, she didn't show you a lot of the statistics, but because someone asked about the specifics, one key takeaway is that like any plants in the yard made a difference. And so that was like what she talked about with total plants versus total native plants. And so what we like to say is basically like, yeah, landscape away, please. And that's going to have a net positive impact on the biodiversity score in our case, so wildlife diversity. But what was interesting with Fanny's research is that it showed like, but if you have a choice, we can find right here in central Iowa that more native plants make a greater difference. And so that's what's kind of like we were trying to toe that line of like showing you too much of the complexity of the statistics that show that. But that was a really great question, and I thought that was kind of an additional way to think about that. Anything to increase tree canopy, shrub canopy, flowers in your yard is going to do well for wildlife. And it just so happens that if you want to do the greatest good, the best way to do that's with native plants.
And so, Adam, there was another question about the biodiversity score, and if it was more highly influenced by the trees, shrubs, and flowers. But it sounds like you're kind of saying whatever you do, it's going to be better than doing nothing.
Yes, and we can answer that. Fanny, do
Okay.
you happen to remember off the top of your head which of those three terms is most has the strongest relationship? Okay. That was I couldn't
Yeah.
remember that.
Yeah, I believe that the strongest relationships were with both the native trees and the native shrubs, which I remember kind of surprised me because I thought it would have been the flowers driving the fact that it was the native model that was better, but it was actually the trees and shrubs. So make sure you're picking native trees and shrubs because those are kind of driving that difference.
Cool. And that's something we'll definitely be sure to message as we like come out with some outreach resources about this. But what Fanny just said is a really important one, so I'm just going to restate it, which is like native woody plants are really making a difference in new subdivisions. Remember, all the way back to the beginning of her presentation, she said we were only working in homes that were built in former crop fields, things that would have been crop fields in the 90s. And we can't those can't be closed canopy forests overnight. And so these are decisions that homeowners are making today that are going to impact biodiversity conservation in Iowa for decades. So that's cool to kind of have that come out of this as well.
Yeah, and that's a really great plug for later in this series on February 19th. We're going to have another speaker coming from landscape architecture at Iowa State University to talk specifically about why you should choose native trees and shrubs and how you might choose some of those to put in your landscape. So that fits really well with what we'll be talking about in a few weeks. So once again, that was going to be on February 19th. If anyone is interested in that, you can come back and join me. Adam and Finney won't be here that day, but I will be here, and you can join me and our new presenter, and we'll be talking further about the native trees and shrubs. Yeah. So we had some other really great questions. I want to get to a few more of these, and then I have a few, just a little bit of information to share with people and some closing thoughts to share with people. So we talked a lot about all these different sources for finding native plants to put into your yard, but rightfully so, sometimes people are scared to put them in because some of them can be a little bit more aggressive or, just advantageous of the environments that they're in. So they're maybe not trying to be, but they just are really good at what they're doing and at surviving. So do you have any good sources for finding out how to choose which of these native plants might not be the right fit for your yard? Maybe they're too aggressive, they spread too much. How do you expect, or how do you suggest, sorry, that people should go about figuring out that information?
Mm, that's an excellent question. I think one of the links I shared, I think it was Iowa Commercially Available Native Plants, and it was the Lady Bird Johnson Wildlife Flower Center that offered that. Specifically includes plants that do well in planned landscapes, so maybe they're a little bit more controlled and more suited to somewhere like someone's yard. So I think that would be a great one to consult. I think also you can always, have some consulting services or consultants come to your yard and do an assessment if you're kind of wondering what plants would be best suited for your yard. I know some of the links I also included some of those services, so you can look into that. And I think maybe just doing a little bit more research online. I'm not an expert myself, if I'm honest. So I think sometimes it just takes kind of digging more into the weeds of pardon the pun, of these specific plants and learning more about their growth habits and how they tend to do in yards.
Yeah, that's great. And we don't expect any Iowa Master Gardeners or anyone in our program to be experts either. So I always love that
Mhm.
advice of you should go and do some of your own research. No one knows everything. Adam, did you have something to add?
the last thing I was going to add, yeah, ditto to all of that. And then I just want to foreshadow, we're currently working on a project related to Fanny's work and some others where we're trying to bring together a database of native plants here in Iowa that is going to include anecdotes about just this question. So I saw that question in the chat and I didn't know. I wasn't aware of an extant resource, but we're gonna have that probably by this summer for sure on the extension website. And we're working with a bunch of different people here on campus that have expertise in like, common pests of native plants or common challenges like I planted bee balm in one place and now it's every place, etc. That comes with native plants that we hope from some of Fanny's research that she didn't actually present tonight, where she's talking to homeowners and community leaders, we know that can be a challenge, like how to make this happen. And we're trying to develop some new resources through Extension to try to help people confront that. So stay tuned, and maybe next winter we'll present about that resource.
Well, that would be wonderful. I'm going to put a pin in that and you'll be hearing from me. That also goes along with one of the other questions that we always get. We got it again tonight. What can residents do when they live in subdivisions that are governed by HOAs? That's where we really, I mean, if you live out in the rural areas, it's easier to say, this is what's going in my yard and I have this much space or maybe even acres rather than just a yard. But current HOA doesn't allow them to have native gardens. What can they do to encourage that practice?
Mhm. Ooh, what they can do to encourage an HOA to
To allow
okay,
them
that's
to have native gardens.
hmm I guess I think the first step would be to talk to your HOA and the people in your HOA and just kind of get a sense of where maybe compromises can be made. Like maybe if you have native plants, but they're in flower beds that are, distinct from the lawn or different practices like that, people are generally more accepting of. So maybe just having conversations, explaining the benefits of native plants, but also explaining how they can beautify your neighborhood and not just, people assume that they might be unsightly, but that's actually not the case if you're managing them in certain ways. So I think first just having a conversation would be a good start.
Great.
Fanny, can I put you on the spot and invite you also to maybe even broaden it? You met with city leaders in central Iowa
Mhm.
and talked about opportunities and barriers for native plants in urban places. What were your insights? Like, what's working and what are some of the challenges like in cities, say in central Iowa? I'm totally putting you on the spot. This will be in her thesis that you could read
Yeah.
soon, but could you like share a little bit about that work that you've been doing?
Yeah, well, it's been interesting talking to different cities and council members and such and what their policies are. It seems like a lot of cities are pretty tolerant of native plants, even if they don't specifically make exceptions for them in their policies. If somebody complains about a yard that has native plants, but it's well maintained and the flowers are in garden beds, it seems like generally the cities are like, oh no, this is a native plant garden, and they aren't going to, do a code enforcement on that. So it kind of seems like maybe more unofficially than officially, cities are pretty tolerant there, but it really kind of varies from city to city. And I think neighbors have a really big influence. So if you could talk to your neighbors and kind of get them on board with this and kind of show the benefits of it, I think that makes a really big difference.
Awesome. That's wonderful. So we have two last questions that I want to get to. They're both about birds, so I grouped them together. This first one is one that I have heard many times. Master gardeners may have heard this many times as well. It's one that always comes up when we talk about native plants and wanting to support insect biodiversity. So this person said, how do I balance feeding the birds and providing plants to support caterpillars and butterflies? Because then I feel like I'm just growing these caterpillars and butterflies to feed to the birds. It's like a smorgasbord.
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I mean, it is true that a lot of birds feed on caterpillars and especially feed their caterpillars to their nestlings, which, need them to grow. I guess I would say just the more variety of food sources you provide, the more birds will have other things they can eat than, just the caterpillars. I mean, it's kind of inevitable that some will be eaten, but just if you have a lot of different food sources for different kinds of birds, some of those caterpillars will survive. There'll be other things for them to eat.
Okay, and then the last question is very specific. How do you go about creating a good habitat for owls specifically?
Okay, that is kind of a hard question. Adam, do you have more expertise there than I
Tag
do?
me in. Let me tell you what we do know. Multiple species of owls in Iowa. The ones that we're probably going to expect to see in urban areas are barred owls, most commonly. They're the ones that say who cooks for you and are common in urban, especially urban wooded areas. Great horned owls and maybe eastern screech owls if you're lucky. And so then what we do is apply the things that Fanny has been teaching us all night about like how do we help, or if we want to like scare away any species of wildlife, how do we pull the levers of wildlife habitat to help those species? In the case of those owls, they're all forested and they all feed in kind of open areas along the edges of forests and natural areas. And so my hunch is to say, if you already live in a wooded neighborhood, then you're already well on the road to having owl habitat. Eastern screech owls nest in holes in trees. Barred owls also will nest in holes in trees or like platforms. And then um, uh, uh, great horned owls will nest in platforms or old nests of other birds. And so finding nesting spots, creating places for them to feed. And if you don't live in a neighborhood that's wooded, make it wooded and it'll be owl habitat in a long time. But that's the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago, and the next best time is May 1st. Not today. Don't plant a tree right now.
Yeah, normally would say right now, but not
Not right
literally
now.
right now, even though it
April.
has been freakishly warm outside, not
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now.
don't fall for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for being here with us this evening. This was great.